One of there are a couple of key pieces that I think are worth really digging into. One is how long it takes to go from a good idea to something that looks like a program. Getting programs started seems to sometimes take a long time. What we found is we keep throwing RFPs over the fence and we get good ideas back, we evaluate them, then we go back, we say we're not liking.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. This week is all about acquisitions and the abnormally delivered and large budget the Space Force is preparing to make use of. This episode is coming to you from the Air and Space Forces Association's annual Aerospace Cyber Conference held at National Harbor in Maryland. Most in the Beltway call this event the AFA. This event is one massive family reunion with a shopping mall full of proposed air and space platforms, software for training, artificial intelligence, and motors for jets and rockets. It's 3 days of dawn to dusk and beyond programming, demonstrations, and briefings with captains of the defense industry and flag officers. And there are receptions to mingle. The AFA is also the event where space and Air Force policies and initiatives are announced. For the Secretary of the Department of the Air Force, that's Troy Meink, his job was to introduce himself and his priorities to the greater community. For other leaders, it's the time to give an update on the state of play and preview what's coming. The SecF has extensive acquisitions experience, and the Space and Air Forces together as a department are likely to receive roughly $250 billion for 2026. Of that money, just over $40 billion will go to the Space Force. But it's not that simple. If you've been listening to past episodes, you may recall that $40 billion will come from two places. First, the very irregular, big, beautiful budget bill passed in July that contained $13.8 billion. And the regular budget bill, that's the one that Congress is now debating. And that's where the administration is asking for the remainder, or $26.3 billion. In the most recent years, the total Space Force budget number has been somewhat flat and hasn't kept up with inflation. So thinking of that $40 billion, a sizable chunk should be used for the Golden Dome. That's the next generation missile defense project. But no one really knows because the plan hasn't yet been revealed. Nevertheless, anticipating a really large inflow of cash, the Space Force needs to be ready to spend. So it should be no surprise that a major theme of this AFA conference is acquisitions. To discuss what was learned, to read between the lines, we have Todd Harrison. He's this podcast's Federal Space and Military Budget Jedi Master. Here's our conversation. Hi, Todd. Welcome back to the Downlink podcast.
Hey, good to be back.
I really appreciate you coming on the podcast to help us all, read the tea leaves. Well, you're a frequent guest across the Defense and Aerospace Reports family of podcasts. Yes, I was told that you were recently on someone else's podcast, but I shall forgive. But, we all have new listeners coming on board, right? So could you take a moment and introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Todd Harrison. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where my research focuses on the defense budget, defense strategy, space policy, and space security. And my background is I've been working in the think tank world for a while now, but I've also gone in and out of the defense industry and served in the Air Force Reserves and am an aerospace engineer by training.
You've been on this podcast a number of times, and you have never said that before. I did not know that you had engineering training. Geesh, I feel wounded here. All right, so this week was really heavy on acquisitions in terms of the theme, right? Of all these, various leaders, including the SecF and the deputy and the flag officers, et cetera, right? And I guess it really shouldn't be a real surprise when we look at how much cash the Space Force may be receiving for 2026. It's what, roughly $40 billion? Am I
Hmm.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
Um, but that number includes what you have called, quote, a sugar high, unquote. Could you very quickly explain to the listeners a breakdown of where the money is coming from? Like, what's the difference between the traditional budget and the big, beautiful budget bill, which some simply call the budget reconciliation bill, and why this presents problems for future years? Because I think it's kind of key for this discussion.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So, you have your regular, what we call the base discretionary budget each year. That is what the administration requests and Congress has to appropriate each year. That's the normal budget that we deal with. So for the Space Force, it's been hovering around 29 billion. Although in the FY 26 request that just came out a few months ago, the administration proposed about an 8% reduction in that budget for the Space Force. Now, this year, there is a special pot of money that was appropriated by Congress. It's technically considered mandatory money, but those words mandatory and discretionary mean something else in the budget than what they mean in the dictionary. It just means that it's on autopilot now. The money is already there. And through that reconciliation bill, there was about 150 billion some odd dollars total for defense, but about 13 billion of it is supposed to be for the Space Force. So when you add that to what the administration requested, even though they requested a cut, the extra reconciliation money ends up making it a pretty big increase in the Space Force's budget, but just for this year.
So there's just really no way they can count on 40 billion being there every year, right?
Absolutely not. It is highly unlikely we're going to get another reconciliation bill that has defense funding in it. Certainly not at this level. Maybe there's an off chance that Republicans in Congress could pull it off next year, but there's no way it can be sustained like that. The reconciliation process is just too difficult to use. And I would note that although reconciliation has been used for many other things many times before, this is the first time it's been used in a big way for defense. This is unprecedented. So I would not count on this funding ever coming back.
All right. So then, with all of this expected money, this cash, you bet the Space Force is looking for ways to buy and invest into the future or for the future, right? But they have to be careful because they are using taxpayer money. So they are stewards trusted to spend it wisely. But there seems to be a significant challenge. A key part of wise spending are the people who are the acquisition officers and civilians. A lot of civilians, in fact, with talent, expertise, and experience. But many of them have been doged, either by deferred resignation or simply let go, right? Have a listen to this from the U.S. Space Force's Space Systems Command's U.S. Space Force Lieutenant General Philip Garrant. His command's whole purpose is to equip the Space Force. He was being asked how his workforce has been impacted since this new administration came into office.
Sure, I'll speak specifically to SSC on the workforce impacts. So on the civilian side, obviously we're supporting the administration's initiative to shrink the federal workforce. At SSC in particular, it was about a 14% reduction in civilian workforce. 150 of the 600 were what we call 4G airmen. So these are Air Force civilians who typically have a base role. So think security forces, firefighters, civil engineers, logisticians, mechanics. And then 450 Space Force civilians typically doing acquisition, all the way from new interns who we had just hired to very experienced, decades of experience, and across all career fields, program management, financial management, AC logistics, contracting. I would offer our biggest impact is in the contracting career field. Ms. Natalie Riedel is my director of contracting. Our workforce is at about 60% with the drawdown, and we were able to leverage remote hiring as a recruiting and retention tool. We do have a number of remote employees, and if those had to reduce as well. We would drop below 50%. And what's hard about that is you mentioned the budget. We have a considerable increase in our budget authority with a smaller workforce. We're truly doing more with less. So how do we
So,
fundamentally change?
when we spoke to the CSO and Chief Master Sergeant, they seemed to imply that integrated mission deltas could lessen the blow to the civilian workforce loss. And I have no reason to think otherwise, but I do have this gut feeling that maybe there's a mismatch here. Todd, can you untangle this?
Yeah, no, it was really great to hear some of the specifics like that. And what jumps out to me is that these Doge cuts, and let me preface that by saying I fully understand these Doge cuts were from the White House, not from the Doge office that was within the Pentagon or within the Air Force. These were the government-wide cuts, and some people even say, well, it's not really Doge cutting it. Because, it was OMB or OPM or the president or whatever.
Yeah, but the email came from Elon Musk's desk,
Yes,
right?
yes,
So, I
exactly.
mean, I'm
So,
not really sure how you could like divorce that, but
but we're
anyway.
using shorthand here, and that's fine. These Doge cuts, they were not targeted. They were not merit based. They were just broadly trying to cut staff across the federal government to save money. And I guess, what's shocking to me is how much that ended up hurting the space acquisitions and the contracting career field for civilians in particular.
And at the very time, though, when when the administration wants to spend money, right?
Exactly. It is completely counterproductive to be forcing or encouraging, incentivizing those people to leave government when they are needed now more than ever. And that is going to come back to bite this administration. And it will ultimately affect how all of this reconciliation funding we just talked about, how it can be executed, how plans for Golden Dome can be executed once they, figure out the architecture. It's going to just throw sand in the gears of everything if you don't have a contracting workforce that can support all of this. We like to talk about moving fast and keeping pace, with commercial innovation. You can't do that without a contracting workforce. I think that is, really
And
telling about the impact, the long-term impact that these Doge reductions are going to have.
but how can actually mission deltas, take on some of that burden? I mean, I also felt like that was kind of a mismatch, right? Because the way
Yeah.
these deltas are being put together, it seems like they have a mission, they have things that they need to do for the fight tonight, and they're able to send their requirements back to Space Systems Command or SSC, right?
Mhm.
So I'm not really sure how they can take up more, right?
Yeah, the
I mean,
mission
they don't have a
deltas.
contracting officer on their like team,
Yeah.
right? It's a requirements person.
Yeah, the mission deltas, it's not fully clear like how they're actually going to be implemented and what change it really means. The one thing that shows me it's not going to be that substantial of a change is that SSC is not going away. All these people are still going to report under SSC. So really, this is just another Space Systems Command internal reorg, which we've seen many times over the years. I remember back when it was the Space and Missile Systems Center, and they transformed it, they reorganized it into a wing structure. So they had a bunch of different wings that were down around different mission areas. So if that's all it is, like not only does that not help you with your contracting workforce shortfalls, it doesn't actually help you integrate better between the operators and the acquirers. As we've talked about before, and I've written about, I think they ought to get rid of Space Operations Command and Space Systems Command and instead just have mission commands and have your operators and your integrators reporting to a mission commander together. They should be in the same reporting chain. As long as you have your acquirers and your operators reporting to totally different bosses, you're not going to be fully integrated at the working level.
And I did actually ask that particular question. And yes, they are still separate, even though allegedly the person who is leading that Delta is in command of everybody under him or her. It's still they're still two big bosses, though, which
Right.
seems to me to be a bit of a rough situation. All right. So, what you were just referencing, speed, right? So, speed of relevancy and the capacity of using certain acquisitions in a contested environment, which is code for various levels of warfare like electromagnetic warfare, jamming, spoofing, to more serious aggression. It was also a theme, right? So the CSO said that there needed to be a new approach to risk. And that would be risk in terms of acquiring new technologies, new capabilities. And in this case, that does mean risk to investments and purchases made with public money. So have a listen to what the CSO said.
Putting more pressure on.
One of the a couple of key pieces that I think are worth really digging into. One is how long it takes to go from a good idea to something that looks like a program. Getting programs started seems to sometimes take a long time. What we found is we keep throwing RFPs over the fence and we get good ideas back, we evaluate them, and then we go back, we say we're not liking, we do an industry day. Why don't we just get together? Why don't we collaborate? Why don't we change the way we exchange ideas so that I understand what their business strategies are? I see what technologies they're advancing in. They're playing in war games and coming up with ideas. So trying to be more collaborative in the early force design efforts so that we can accelerate getting to the good idea that we think is worth pursuing. And the other one is test. And I talked a little bit about it. Sometimes I think we're so rigorous, we have these exacting standards, and we just need to think about a different risk profile. Doesn't mean we're going to be risk-free. It means we're going to have to manage the risk differently and look at what we're testing and when we can bring things into ops faster to get better benefit. I think those are two areas that we can kind of control that might pay off for us in terms of compressing the overall timeline.
We'll go to Vivian, then Shelley. Next.
Hi, good morning.
All right. So I'm not sure how long you and I, and especially you, have been hearing about getting the latest technology and capabilities into the hands of the warfighter, right? Faster.
Yep.
It's been years. There have been some changes. Some things have gotten attention faster than others. I can think of True Anomalies, Rendezvous, and Proximity satellites, right? That was pretty quick from flash to bang. And some other examples. But really, talking the talk and walking the walk are different. What does the Space Force really need to do to walk the walk, right?
Yeah.
This is a challenge to this whole acquisitions process as well. No?
It is. And, I think there's a few things they could do, some of which they've tried in the past and, not clear what happened to these efforts, and other things it's not clear they've tried at all. But, number one, the biggest restriction on getting new programs started is our budget cycle. There is a way around that. You got to work with Congress and OMB to get this through, but the Space Force needs an innovation working capital fund, is what I would call it, where you've got a pot of money. It's colorless money that doesn't expire. A little bit more gets put in every year, and you can take from that to immediately start new initiatives or pursue new ideas when the opportunity arises. So instead of trying to be reactive and waiting for a problem to happen and then come up with an acquisition solution and start a program to address that problem, this would be more of a proactive, opportunity-based innovation fund that you could pull from. Yeah, and is that a high bar to get that? Get the appropriators and the authorizers on board with that? Absolutely. It's probably even a higher bar to get the Office of Management and Budget to agree to something like this. But that would get past that, the typical budget cycle. The other thing is to, where possible, it's not always possible, but where possible, why don't you prototype stuff as a service, before you necessarily commit to building and buying and operating your own system? If companies are out there that can do this, just say, hey, build it and put it up there and operate it for me, and I'll pay you to do that as a service. And then you let the company kind of internally iterate on their own and figure out how to apply development funding because it'll be their development funding. You just give them an assured contract, and if they can provide that capability on orbit, that you'll buy it. So that's another way. Now, I think that the general also brought up a great issue about testing, and yeah, sometimes we do test things a little too far, or test them in ways that were never anticipated by the folks who are writing the requirements. I will tap into my systems engineering knowledge here and say, a best practice is actually when you're writing requirements, write the test acceptance criteria in parallel. We don't do that in defense, and JSIDS doesn't do that. What we do is we say we write a bunch of requirements, and then we wait till the end and we say, okay, now that years have passed and we better understand the threat environment, now we're going to come at you with this is how we're going to test it. And it's like, wait a second, like that's fair that there's new threats out there, but that was not the requirement originally. So of course it's going to fail, right? So write the test acceptance criteria from the beginning so that the contractor knows if I build it, here's how they're going to test it. I can test this myself and tell you before I finish building it if it's going to pass that or not. And you can write that into the contract as well. So yeah, if you want to move faster on testing, but with some assurance that you're getting what you wanted at the time you wrote those requirements, that would be a big improvement.
I think one of the other things that the CSO said, and that I don't really have a great sort of, clip for it or in terms of time and to play that for everybody. But the other thing that he said is that, we don't need to strive for perfection. We need to strive for things that work in a contested environment, right? And I think that also goes back to your test part, though, because the test is, looking for perfection, is it not?
It is often the tests are looking for perfection, and lower some of your criteria and say I guess really get out of the mission assurance mindset. And
they're not NASA, so
exactly,
right?
There aren't humans on these things, and so sometimes having a system that will work 80% of the time, if the cost is so much lower that you could afford to buy, 2 or 4 or 10 of these systems, that's better than having one system that works 95 or 99% of the time.
All right. So now we're going to turn back to the Space Force budget because you have to, have a plan when you've got this kind of money coming in, right? A vision for the future. And also you want to keep to an annualized process, right? Because that's what works with Congress to maintain, sustain, and invest in the future, people and equipment. Now, if we just look at what the administration is asking for in the regular annual budget, it's, as you said, it's pretty underwhelming, an 8% cut, right? And, as a standalone ask, it seems super risky to bet on receiving that $13 billion plus up that was in this year's reconciliation bill. So, are we stuck with a flat budget? So here's what the Secretary of the Department of the Air Force, Troy Meink, said.
With the presidential budget request for 2026, if you set aside the big, beautiful bill, the Space Force budget took a cut, right? A, why is that? And B, is there something you're going to be able to do, or the Pentagon maybe, to make sure that the Space Force budget at least keeps up with the rate of inflation?
So you can't just look at one piece. There's two pieces of the funding bill, the reconciliation and then the budget submission.
But the reconciliation bill, sir, is like a sugar high, isn't it? I mean, it's a one-time kind of thing.
It's a bit sugar high, though.
True. No, everybody I've talked to loves it.
So I think if you look at the totality, and again, I'm not going to try to, I'm not even going to try to guess how the 27 turns out and what the various approaches are going to be used by the Hill. That is definitely above my pay grade. I would just say that if you look at the totality of the support we got from Congress and the administration, the Department of the Air Force, both the Air Force itself and the Space Force increased, and in particular the Space Force increased significantly.
So I think that was kind of a non-answer. I'm just going to say it out loud, right? But, and I was kind of stunned that he wasn't thinking about 2027 or wouldn't guess, but his department should be working on the 2027 presidential budget request now, right? And
Uh,
I mean, and I understand that he can't say how it'll turn out at the end of the process. Oh, okay, great. I got that. But he does have to have an idea of what it's going to take to sustain and maintain and invest in the future. No?
no, that's fair. I mean, I would read what he was saying as basically, look, we ended up doing fine in fiscal year 26, thanks to Congress and the administration, but really Congress. And FY27 is still in play. And, what I'd like to hear from him is like, okay, well, what's still in play in 27? I know you can't give, pre-decisional information, but what does the FY27 Space Force and the broader Department of the Air Force budget, what does it depend on? I would think one of the big factors that's still in play is Golden Dome and what architecture is selected and what type of capabilities are in it and how quickly they're planning on moving out on those capabilities and how they plan to pay for them. That is going to be, huge for the Space Force's budget. And yeah, let's just acknowledge that that is a big unknown still in the FY27 budget that the Pentagon is, still building. Now, and to put it in perspective, normally at this point in the budget process, FY27 will be in the program review phase where the Deputy Secretary of Defense and CAPE are leading a big review. So the services would have already finished their draft budgets. They like to call them a POM. They would already have submitted those to DOD, to the Office of Secretary of Defense, and then that group led by the deputy would be reviewing them all and picking up, big issues that weren't addressed adequately or whatever the case may be. I suspect that we're not really in that phase right now, that there's too many big pieces that are still left unaddressed, namely Golden Dome, that I don't know that they can really do that full program review yet and try to fit within whatever top line OMB has given them without figuring out what some of those big bills are that they're going to have to pay.
See, but here's the thing. Let's take Golden Dome out of the picture, right? And if we look at the presidential budget request for 26, that's an 8% cut. That's an 8% cut on top of inflation. So again, the question that wasn't answered was, well, how is the Space Force presidential budget request going to keep up at least with inflation as opposed to going backwards? And just to be flat, right? And
yeah, I mean,
he didn't go there.
In his defense, I will say that Dr. Meink had not yet been confirmed when those final decisions and the 26 budget requests were being made.
Oh,
he wasn't in the room for a lot of these
meetings. But he's got to have an opinion. He's an acquirer by trade, right? I mean, he knows budgets. He knows how money works. He understands economy. He buys the same, carton of eggs like the rest of us. So he knows inflation is a real deal.
Yeah. And, that's something that they got to deal with. And, I think that in this position as secretary, he's got a lot more purview over areas other than acquisition. And that those cost, areas are also presenting problems.
Exactly.
You look at the cost of personnel, the cost of healthcare, benefits, those types of issues, and the day-to-day, operation cost, sustainment costs, and the whole civilian workforce, many of whom do, well, not in the Space Force, but in the Air Force, many of them are doing support, maintenance type jobs, depot level stuff. So he's got a lot more of these issues to deal with. And yeah, inflation hits all of those costs. And in fact, typically we see that operation and maintenance and personnel costs, they typically grow on a per person basis at about 2.5% above inflation.
Yep.
So if your budget's flat, those costs are going to be eating out the portion of your budget that's left for acquisitions.
All right. So, well, the SecAF seemed to have left his crystal ball on his desk. Space Force leadership seems to know that they have to strike while the iron is hot. Well, they have a lot of support, right? And possibly a one-time budget to match. So that right now probably is their best time to take a shot at getting a solid forward leaning budget for developing the right personnel and developing the right capabilities from now until 2040. And so the CSO announced that there would be 2 new documents coming perhaps by the end of even this year that look specifically 15 years out. Now, one is called the Future Operating Environment, and the other is the Objective Force. Here's what he told us journalists about what's coming.
Thank you. Just, sometimes you're sitting there writing these things out and you think, is anybody going to be listening to me? And thank you. So I appreciate that. The future operating environment is going to be an important document for us. What we need is an authoritative source that people can point to and say, this is what the Space Force is thinking. This is what the demand, we talk about the demand signal to industry. Well, what documents that demand signal? And so the concept for the future operating environment is several different elements. First, what missions are being asked of the Space Force? AMTI. Don't do it now, going to do it in the future. What mission, are we going to give up any missions? Right now, we're not thinking about it, but there could be a time when we have to think about that. So what is the balance of missions that are being asked of the Space Force? What's the threat environment? What is the threat environment now? What do we expect the threat environment to look like in 2040? Because we're going to have to counter that in order to continue to do our missions. And then I think the other part that's pretty important is what technologies are progressing? What are the trends in technology that we can take advantage of or that will be used against us if we're not paying attention? So you start to combine all those things and you evaluate, you find SMEs out there, you find the experts, you find future casters that start to think about these things, and you compile it all together and you say, all right, there's a lot of variables here, but this is what our current thinking is. This is the future operating environment as we see it right now for 2040. And then,
All right, so the CSO said the idea was to present these 2 documents at the same time and every 5 years. So it's kind of like a 15-year plan, right? Updated every 5 years. What do you think? Will these documents, best military advice, have an impact?
Well, it depends. It depends how credible they are and depends on how detailed they are. I would first of all say, modeling our planning process on the Chinese Communist Party is probably not an innovative, inspiring way to go with these master plans and 5-year plans and things. But DOD does tend to do that. So just, put that in the back of your head. Is that really the way we want to be operating? I would say that the future threat environment, I wouldn't put a lot of weight on that. That's just guessing, right? Who knows what's going to happen 1 year from now, much less 15 years from now. Yeah, people should think about it, but it's just guessing at 15 years. The objective force, though, could be highly consequential if it's detailed. If it says this is, what types of capabilities and what quantity of them we think we're going to need over the next 15 years, and this is our plan. And I say that, because what it would be great to see is for the Space Force to have something like the Navy has done for many years in a 30-year shipbuilding plan, where industry can look out and say, okay, this is the force that they're building towards in the future, because these things take a long time. And so industry can kind of plan according to that. Of course, it's not set in stone. They update that, shipbuilding plan every year. You come out, or you're supposed to come out with an update to it, but it gives you a basic idea of how are the vectors shifting here going forward. I would love to see the Space Force do something like that. I think updating it every 5 years is completely inadequate. They would need to update this every year. With every budget request, they ought to come out with a new objective force that goes with it and says, hey, here's our budget request, here's our 5-year funding projection, and here's our 15-year projection of the force we're trying to build. And every year that needs to be updated, it needs to be scrubbed and scrutinized. And that's how you get to a better spot in the future, is through that kind of openness and transparency with industry, with Congress, with the public.
But I also see these new publications as something a little bit more as well, though, because isn't this the Space Force seizing the moment to actually speak for itself, right? More directly to both the White House and Congress, no matter the administration? Or am I just reading too much into these initiatives?
Absolutely. It does give them, a platform to have an independent voice about their domain, about, the Space Force's operating environment that no one else will have a say in but them, right? And so, yeah, it can be an important platform. It's only going to be an effective platform if that objective force document has a sufficient level of detail in it. If it's a bunch of hand wavy stuff that says we're going to do AMTI and that's, and we're going to do GMTI and we're going to do whatever other acronym, right? um, you know, and we're going to, do space control, rah, rah. If all it says is that level of detail, it's not going to be worth the paper it's printed on. If it says this is the constellation we're envisioning to do AMTI, it's going to be 180 satellites organized into, 12 orbital planes. It will cover these inclinations, these latitudes, that, and, we will be able to, detect and track this many targets simultaneously at any point on Earth. That's the kind of thing that they need to show people. And then industry will understand, oh, that's the capability that you want. That's what we need to be building towards. And if you're in industry and you want to attract investors, you got to show them there's a demand signal. This document would give a demand signal that, startup companies especially, but, private equity backed, venture capital backed companies, they could go to investors and say, hey, look, we got a demand signal. We can be the ones to meet this. And so, yeah, if they use this properly, it will give them quite a bit more influence and more of a voice in what's happening to the Space Force.
All right, now we're running out of time, but you recently had a to-do list for Congress. And I'm wondering where that list touches upon this AFA's main theme of acquisitions. And I need you to do this quickly because of time. What's your number one to do? I know this is cruel. I'm just asking for one. That Congress now needs to take on board in light of what the Space Force and the Department of the Air Force are signaling. And this is kind of an important time because we're running out of road before we don't have an open government because of the budget, right? So what's the to-do besides, keeping the government open?
Yeah, no, and just to preface this, this is something that I co-authored with my colleagues, Mackenzie Eaglin and Bill Greenwald. We came up with 9 items on the to-do list. Since this is a space-focused podcast, I will tell you the space ones. Number 1, we need a commission to modernize the Space Force personnel system. And number 2, we need to mandate that the Space Force transitions to mission commands and gets rid of Space Systems Command and Space Operations Command. Those are the 2 big items that I want to see Congress take care of this year when they do the compromise conference committee version of the NDAA. I would love to see them take on these 2 big space items in there.
Fantastic. And Todd, thank you so much for making the time to come on the Downlink podcast.
Glad I could do it.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavas Ships with Chris Cavas and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.